I published a book recently, and it's called Naked at the Mic, and it's a survival of a liberal in a time of peril. And it's available on Amazon and .com, BarnesandNoble.com, and iUniverse.com. It's also available on digital format, and that's what it looks like. It took 5 years to write this book, and it's a chronicled autobiography, actually, if you will, of my radio program on WQQQ 103.3 FM, located in Lakeville, Connecticut. But we've been doing that show for 7 years, and I found that there's so many aspects and so many people and interviews that we've done over that time period, and we've covered so much news, international, national news, heading into the Iraq War, and we started on actually March 4th, 2003, and I'd like to just read the introduction so that, and I'm going to read some segments, a few chapters of the book, and so you can get an idea of what it's about. And I hope you follow along and enjoy. Naked at the Mic, The Survival of a Liberal in a Time of Peril, is an autobiographical account of the establishment of the LA Steel Liberal Talk radio show and the events and people that led to the program's survival and success on commercial radio since March 4th, 2003. The chapters and subsequent essays accurately describe personal perspectives on the political and social events of 2000 through to 2009, and offer a critical and often satirical analysis of the demise and defense of liberalism in America. The events and news items mentioned in this book were personally witnessed and reported on the author's television, radio, and internet broadcasts, or written and published by the author on his website, lasteelshow.org. Section 2 of Naked at the Mic is entitled Essays and Insights, and it is comprised of 166 essays and insights selected from over 500 published works on from the lasteelshow.org website. The essays and insights in this book have been divided into 6 sections, and I broke them down into the national politics, international politics, satire, mainstream media, patriotism, and metaphysics. Of course, all statements of facts made in this book are verifiable in audio recordings or of specific broadcasts from the lasteelshow.org audio archives at blogtalkradio.com/lasteelshow.org. And credit, documents, or excerpts of the book or articles of or items as quoted are throughout the entire text and appear relevant to the topic. I documented a whole lot of articles, evidence, things that we've read and reported on our radio show, and also on our television show. I've done actually 12 documentaries, more, meaning 5, 6-part programs. Also focusing on a number of issues around the state and around the country. We did 2 programs, two full documentaries on the January 18th, 2003 Washington, D.C. Anti-war march and rally, and the September 24th, 2005 anti-war march and in Washington, D.C. We interviewed a number of people down there, and now a lot of that is in the book. I have 25 actual pictures of the many different people we've interviewed, and also the context of the book is, I can put a warning up here for this because it's not your typical book. It's a very critical book against the Bush administration, and against society as it is and against conservatism, but primarily it's a defense. The original title that I had changed was actually a defense of liberalism, and a bold defense of liberalism in America. And it covers the rise and demise, okay, of liberalism since the advent of Ronald Reagan in 1981 and the 1980 election. So I'm going to begin reading. What I'd like to do is begin with the introduction, since it's quite self-explanatory, and we'll go on from there. O believe as thou livest, that every sound that is spoken over the round world, which thou oughtst to hear, will vibrate on thine ear. And that's from the Oversoul, the first series by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And his works have inspired me over many, many, many years. And we have done a number of television programs actually on it, and on Emerson. But that particular statement has always vibrated with me, because there's so much truth in that, that those who are meant to hear things will hear them. Those who aren't, of course, won't. But what was meant for you to hear, particularly this program, or parts of this program that were meant for you to grasp or possibly remember, will always come to you. And in my book, I've broken this down. I have a number of metaphysical essays pertaining to my research over the many years, but I also do on my Blog Talk radio program, which is an internet program, 2 nights a week, I devote to metaphysical topics. We have guests, and we read selected works and so on, and explain the many metaphysical aspects of my very broad, possibly 35 years or so of research in that, in certain fields, with many, many guest experts. Also, we'll get in. I wanted to read a few of those this evening, a few of the essays from that, and introduce you to some of the esoteric topics that we discuss on our radio shows. I'll continue with the introduction. It was nearly 0 degrees in D.C. on January 18th, 2003. But Lila and I were warmed by our anger and the anger of 500,000 committed and courageous American patriots marching together in one remarkable display of democracy and First Amendment rights. The invasion of Iraq was going to happen. We all knew it. But all we could do was be there to shout and march. Few, if any, of us realized what would become of the U.S. Constitution and the nation in just a few short months. It was a day later, on January 19th, 2003, when we arrived home, that we realized the American free mainstream media was completely controlled by the Bush government. They totally ignored the largest gathering of anti-war protesters in Washington, D.C. since the Vietnam War protests. Every media warmonger was fully exposed to the world as they heralded the Iraq War from every radio and television studio in the country. Idiots, criminals, thieves, and hypocrites of the worst kind were given the run of the media as pundits. The propaganda push was everywhere, and any intelligent, liberty-loving, liberal American was lashing obscenities at his television, radio, and newspaper. Every patriotic, peace-loving American was horrified and stupefied by the pro-war conservative insanity they were hearing and seeing coming from their mainstream media nonstop every hour of every day. I had been on statewide television for 4 years and had a popular weekly series, but I was determined to be on radio to combat the right-wing war insanity. That was taking over this country. Phil Donahue was canceled by MSNBC. Ralph Nader was all but silenced and demonized by the Democratic Party for driving the stake in their heart during the 2000 campaign. He exposed their hypocrisy, incompetence, and criminality to the merciless effects of truth and light of day. There was no one broadcasted nationally or locally who would stand up against the neocons and the conservative call for war. Every major commercial radio and television station was being ethnically cleansed of any liberal anti-war commentary and replaced by conservative radio contract killers hired by the broadcast networks to destroy all common sense and liberal thought in America. A study sponsored by the Democratic Party in 2003 stated that of all commercial radio stations nationwide, there were 3,000 hours per week of conservative talk radio and only 80 hours per week of liberal talk radio shows. I was determined that the LA Steel Show would be on a commercial station and it could be a viable program worthy of commercial sponsorship. I was convinced that there were sponsors who would stand up for free speech and liberal ideals. Most people have, I would read this first chapter, but I think I'll skip it and I'll let people, I hope you enjoy it, only because a lot of people have expressed that they really enjoyed the first chapter. Whether or not they read the whole book or not, but the first chapter they were excited about, and it's how the show began. But due to time, I wanted to read several other, I think, pertinent chapters, and in a couple of essays. Chapter 5 is quite significant in that it lays the groundwork, or not lays the groundwork, but it reveals the demise and the cause and reason for the demise of liberalism in America since basically since the Reagan era. And I wanted to start with that, and that's chapter 5. It's called The Assassination of Liberalism. In June of 2003, I interviewed Jim DiEugenio, editor with Lisa Pease of a great book, The Assassinations. The book was a thorough analysis and summation of their research and articles first printed in Probe magazine on the assassinations of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm X. The book had a profound effect on me, as did my discussion with Jim DiEugenio. Up until that time, I had always had my own suspicions about the assassinations of these men. How could the United States government inquiries have so callously disregarded, or discarded actually, all information and intelligence gathering by the FBI and CIA and credible journalists surrounding the murders of these national liberal icons, without noting the full complicity of the cover-up by the US government and its whitewashing investigation committees? These investigation committees were used to discredit and minimize the obvious conspiracies. These committees would ensure the revision of history and would blame lone gunmen for the death of American liberal leaders. Once I read the book, I understood why. After speaking with the book's authors on several interviews, my views of conservatism and my government changed forever. This book later led me to accumulate a systemic understanding of the motives and manipulations that propelled the madness of the neocons and their theft of the US government. Liberal ideals embedded in the generations of Americans are not dead. They live silently within our souls, waiting for a new leader to spark the flames of revolutionary enlightenment lying dormant within us. Americans need a leader who incites the radicalism that sparked the first American Revolution, and a leader who can be trusted to guide with the core belief in our Constitution and reignite this flame of liberalism that was extinguished by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm X. The radical black movement was stunted after the assassination of Malcolm X, and the civil rights movement was severely crippled after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The liberal and far-reaching visions of John and Robert Kennedy for America became clouded and dissolved. Their public threats to rid America of the yoke of the Federal Reserve, end the war in Vietnam, and defend the civil rights of all minorities brought fear to the static establishment, officials, and government. John Kennedy captivated the minds and hearts of all forward-thinking people, but he alienated warmongers, the military-industrial complex, greed-driven bankers, and organized crime figures who truly rule the world. It was after I read the assassinations that reality sunk in, and my lightweight liberal ideals changed to a firm resolve. I became resolved to the ideal that radical change against a corrupt system of government must be the goal of any true patriot. And liberalism was what the U.S. was founded upon. American liberals must become organized and radicalized, and must believe and defend their unalienable rights and freedoms provided for in their Constitution. American liberals must not be manipulated by the madness of a foreign and artificial reality created by propagandists or Republican and Democratic strategists who seek the total destruction of American liberalism and their basic rights of the individual to live and think freely and pursue happiness without a corrupt government or being dominated and dictated to by one religion. The horror of the fascist, neoconservative, globalist, and unifying vision was first to divide America and society, then reunify it under one global government ruled by international elite. The safety of the entire world must be the first and foremost consideration of human consciousness, not a cowardly, contemptuous philosophy of neocon preemptive insanity, reactionary fascism, or theocratic idealism. Another assassination that has not been mentioned, but had the effect of destroying all hope of the liberal authenticity and spiritual challenge to the conservative coup of Reaganism, the rise of Bush Sr.'s New World Order, and finally G.W. Bush's neocon dictatorship, was the assassination of John Lennon. John Lennon's shocking death in 1980 silenced the last great voice of freedom and peace. All who had hoped and looked forward to his comeback, his new inspirational songs, liberal stature for peace, were shattered by his death. The liberal optimism of the Woodstock generation was buried in 1980 and replaced by the artificial, selfish, short-sighted, and heartless vision of greed-driven Republicans backed by corporations. This vision was a nation and world enslaved by a debt-driven consumerism and temporary prosperity that would steal America's future. Conservatives foolishly attempt to glorify past achievements and reclaim the intolerance, bigotry, and short-sightedness of their past conservative and reactionary leaders. The following is a quote from a passage written by Jim Diogenio from page 638 of his and Lisa Pease's book, The Assassinations. This passage adequately and profoundly illustrates the catastrophic event 4 assassinations had on the liberal movement in the United States. Imagine, if you can, that if in the mid-1980s, at the height of the GOP revolution, Ronald Reagan, Pat Robertson, Newt Gingrich, and George Bush Sr. had all been assassinated in the space of 5 years. Would the Republicans and the media not suspect something more than coincidence or happenstance? Would their party and their causes be able to sustain the loss? Would Dan Quayle and Bob Dole have been able to pick up the baton? Would history not have been quite different? Certainly the Democrats were not able to sustain the loss. Nothing comparable filled the gap. Nothing even came close. So the constellation fell from the sky, and without any pressure from the left, our public debate shifted slowly, inexorably to the left, or rather to the right, sorry. Eugenio also states that billionaire Richard Mellon Scaife created a movement in the 1970s that began to create a conservative political sea change. And the Scaife-funded movement transformed itself into a juggernaut under Reagan-Bush. Robert Strauss became a driving force in the creation of the Democratic Leadership Committee to ensure that no Democratic candidate would stray too far away from the GOP model. As Ralph Nader has noted, the age of Dem Rep or Rep Dem was upon us. And how does anyone tell the difference between the two parties? And when the differences are that narrow, why bother to vote? In 2000, Ralph Nader cut out the heart of the Democratic Party by exposing the duopoly of the US political process. Nader's greatest speeches tore the mask off of phony democratic liberalism and exposed it for what it was. A watered-down, corporate-driven agenda most identical to the Republican agenda. Jimmy Carter was the first obvious corporate-owned Democrat. His barefoot farm boy image may have won him the election against Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon and his bumbling image. But it's debatable if Ford, with all of his faults, would have made a better president in 1976. I voted for Carter and was fooled like all liberals who still believe that the Democratic Party stood for something. We soon found out that Carter's further deregulation of the energy, transportation, and banking industries that began under Ford identified Carter as a corporate shill under the influence of his infamous national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. The New World Order, through Carter, got its firm foothold on the American political system, and by the end of Carter's horrible term in office, he had plunged the US economy into chaos and deep recession. Gasoline prices doubled and OPEC created an embargo. Iran took over the American embassy and held 52 hostages for over a year. It was the financial carnage of the 1970s and 1980s, Nixon's resignation, the shameful end of the Vietnam War, the resignation of a Republican president, and the blatant corruption of a democratically controlled Congress, and the cynicism and disillusionment of an entire generation by the assassination of 5 of its greatest leaders, that destroyed America's liberal idealism and paved the way for the horrors committed by the G.W. Bush regime. The late 60s and early 70s ended in broken dreams of peaceful solutions to war and rebellion. Liberals fought gun battles and served prison sentences as conscientious objectors. Anarchists revolted to destroy the failing American system. College campuses exploded in violence as student protesters were beaten and killed by police and National Guardsmen. Without a direction, the generation of hope and liberal optimism turned into and against itself. It turned into a they turned on to marijuana, cocaine, LSD, disco, punk rock, pornography, and other mind-numbing expressions of madness. In the 1970s created the gateway for the reactionary political revolution of the 1980s. Without honest, visionary, and passionate liberal leadership to inspire the soul of America, the short-sighted conservative vision of plutocratic government, massive military spending, and credit-fueled consumerism, allied with corporate fascism, became the only vision Americans could see. It was the only vision offered to them. A vision embraced by their parents, encouraged by their iconic movie and music celebrities of the superficial nihilistic pop culture, flamed by the corporate-controlled media, that said it was good to buy and spend more money than we could afford. Turn on and tune out. Celebrities are gods. It is good to get into debt to fuel the economy. Those great lies and illusions created the hopeless vision that led to the financial crashes of the late 70s and early 80s, early 1990s, 2000, and again in 2008. Liberalism died with the death of John Lennon in 1980 and the birth of Reagan conservatism in 1981. The year Ronald Reagan took office. According to Reagan and the Republican Party, everyone could make good in America unless they were a minority. Everyone could go to college if they had enough money and were not a member of a minority. Reagan's image and self-sufficient philosophy inferred to Americans not to be concerned about the inequities in their society and to focus on bettering themselves. Americans began to focus on self-love, self-help, how to get rich and enjoy the pleasures money brings. Greed is good. The goal of the 80s was to become a debt billionaire like Donald Trump and a born-again Christian if you were feeling empty and soulless. Join a right-wing lunatic conservative cult, okay? Or send money to a television evangelist to relieve your guilt. The end of the world is near, and so that's what we were told. Christ is coming again real soon. Enjoy life while you can, Mr. and Mrs. Liberal, before all liberals are sent to hell. This was and still is the message of the new political conservative movement and its new mindless cloned offspring, conservative cyborg, young Republicans, programmed for sexual abstinence and binge drinking as pro-life BMW, Ford, and Chevy pickup owners, whose intellectual icons are Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, G.W. Bush, Ann Coulter, and Glenn Beck. The word liberal, according to Webster's unabridged dictionary, means to believe in the good of man. The word conservative, from the same reference source, means to believe in the evil of man. It would seem, based on the actual meaning of both words, that Christ was a liberal. It's time liberals took pride again in their beliefs. Pride again in believing in the good of mankind. How we let the conservative right-wing wingnuts strip us of our philosophy and vision is our crime against ourselves and the future generations of Americans. We have been beaten down and emotionally abused by conservative crazies and cannot or will not see the beauty, dignity, and nobility of liberalism. Free thinkers are liberals. To be a liberal-minded individual is to be the best and most generous one can be. To be a conservative conjures up Charles Dickens' images of Scrooge, meanness, cheapness, war, hate, bigotry, cruel social policies, archaic social concepts, clinging to past glory, past pain, and misanthropy. Let the children of the world forsake the confines of the past fallacies and destroy the myths created by the corruption of conservative thought and be led by high moral integrity and truth. Conservatives and fundamentalists have stolen control of U.S. society and are imposing a pseudo-morality void of human dignity and integrity. To be a liberal is not to be a communist or a socialist or an anarchist. To be a liberal is to be a complete, free, and enlightened being, fearing no one and believing that any obstacle can be overcome with reason and enlightened thought. Liberals must take back their stolen pride, take back the world they live in, by a courage and commitment to a vision of the continued advancement of mankind toward enlightenment. The next chapter I wanted to read was chapter 7. Jesus was a liberal. Throughout the last 30 years or so, conservatives have demonized liberal concepts and liberalism. Everywhere you go, everything you hear, oh, liberals, 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 you know, Ann Coulter, you know, how to, there's just so many of them. Oh, by the way, you can buy an Ann Coulter book, you know, today on Newsmax.com. I saw 3 conservative books for $3 the other day. Glenn Beck's new book, Michelle Malkin's new book, and Ann Coulter's new book, all for $1. I mean, now that, you know, that kind of tells you, you know, the value of those books, and the value of that thing, and as well as, you know, the value of, you know, how they become bestsellers. And the way that they become conservative books become bestsellers is that conservative sponsors will buy hundreds of thousands of these books as giveaway promotions, all right? But they buy them from the seller, you know, from the retail outlets or whatever, Barnes & Noble or whoever they have a deal with. They'll buy them at a substantial discount and then offer them as giveaways, all right, and promotional tools. There aren't too many, if any, liberal backers that do that. That's why there aren't as many liberal books on the market that are, you know, extreme bestsellers the first week they're out. So it interests me to see this publishing machine, all right, or this I shouldn't say publishing machine, but this purchasing machine, all right, that still knocks out liberal writers from the bestseller lists around the country, or excuse me, all these multi-million-dollar ad campaigns by different publishers, but also promoted by different, you know, political groups and PAC groups and so on, that offer authors books that, you know, for joining up to their organization or something, you know. So it's like the liberal, unfortunately, is so disadvantaged, all right? And of course, the conservative market and the conservative radio talk shows have so disabled, okay, the liberal voice to the extent that you know, like an O'Reilly or a Beck or somebody like that come out or Fox News, you know, will come out and just, you know, laugh, you know, or ridicule liberal authors or liberal pundits by their who say that for anti-war sentiments or you know, the unpopular liberal stances on issues, whether it be environment or whatnot. But we and I in my book I also go through. I have a chapter on the environmental menaces from the left and the right that I speak about. It's the name of the chapter, actually. But of all the conservative lies, of all the media lies and propaganda that have so diminished the values of liberalism in this country and around the world, basically, but especially in this country. The greatest lie, the greatest mistruth, the greatest of all of them was their self-righteous possession of Christianity and the philosophy of Christianity, and to create this iconic conservative God, okay, of Christ, when Christ was a liberal. He was a radical liberal. He was an extreme liberal. He was a revolutionary above all revolutionaries. He created a revolution that lasted over 2,000 years. All right? No fundamentalist moron could possibly understand that. So what did they do? They grabbed this concept. They grabbed the God concept, made it into a conservative issue. Liberals are the most God-like people in their ideals. Liberals are compassionate. They are people who give monies and time. They're the ones out there that are helping in the homeless centers, that are sponsoring the homeless centers, the national organizations of environmentalists and some people. These are liberals. These are people who have heart and have compassion. Rather than getting angry, which is something I often do, and is one reason that I wrote this book, so as not to banter too much or rant, but I believe this book, this chapter, sums it up. It sums up the theft of religion, the theft of Christianity, by the misanthropy of the Christian right. The morons, the complete and utter idiots, okay, of these evangelical temples of Satan, all right, have hijacked the beauty of this religion and have hijacked the nature of Christ and the concepts of Christhood, which is the perfection. The Christhood is what mankind should achieve in his evolutionary enlightenment, in his ascension to a higher being, all right? Christ would not go to war. Christ would not advocate war. Christ would not advocate hatred. Christ would not advocate the death and destruction of Islam or Judaism or, Buddhists or whatever. He would not advocate anything like that. So how does a evangelist, conservative, right-wing lunatic possibly advocate death and destruction to another race? How can they possibly, in their right minds, advocate war, advocate greed, advocate all of the evils of our society and convert them to some form of virtue? This is what the conservative mindset has done to our country and to the American economy, the American mindset. It's created a bunch of babbling fools, all right? So let me before I go off, let me explain this as I did. It's a short chapter. Jesus was a liberal. The radical liberal individual is merely a man or a woman who has found peace within themselves and pursues an inner voice or drummer, as Thoreau stated. In this state of mind, one always runs into conflict, controversy, and confrontation. It's part of the package. A radical is like a fish swimming upstream against the current toward his destiny. We don't really know why we have to do it. We just have to do it. Our instincts and convictions make us fight the current. When something is terribly wrong around us, we are not able to keep quiet or let it happen and continue without a fight. It is the way we are. Radicals have been associated with the left of center ideologies and reactionaries associated with the right. We are basically the same, except pitted against each other by ideologies. The radical insists on moving forward, while the reactionary insist on moving backwards. The biggest lie the right has used to their great advantage is their self-righteous claim to high moral values as validated by their literal misinterpretation of the Bible. How dare we attack the Word of God? Conservatives forget that the words of they consider sacred are not necessarily the words of God, but the multiple translations and often mistranslated words of men that have deliberately edited, eliminated, and misinterpreted and manufactured the words of God's prophets. God, according to biblical or Bible scholars, never personally wrote anything down. He never, according to the Bible, instructed anyone but Moses to write down the 10 Commandments, of which Moses later shattered in anger at the Israelites. Once he descended the mountain after many days of communing with God through a burning bush. The King James Version of the Bible was interpreted by Francis Bacon and other known Masons. Bacon was the founder of the Rosicrucians. King James was considered by many of the Christian world during his time as a pervert and a known believer in paganism. The King James Bible was considered a deliberate misinterpretation of the ancient text promoted by the English king to confuse the English-speaking world of its true content. The first Puritans carried the Geneva Bible with them. David Bay, the founder of Cutting Edge Ministries and cuttingedge.org, created a fascinating documentary entitled The Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings. He is also one of the few individuals in the world that has a printed copy made from the original King James Bible. In an illuminating discussion with David Bay, he stated on my show that the original edition of the King James Bible was decorated in pagan symbolism. Illustrations of pagan gods and goddesses, dragons and mythological demons and symbols were prominently displayed on the cover and throughout the book. The original texts were transcribed and translated by the early Roman Catholic Church, and the collection of works was edited, sorted, and translated from ancient Arabic into Latin, and supposedly by French monk Saint Jerome in a monastery in France. The Catholic text was first printed in Germany in 1455. The first printing made the Bible available to scholars and the public for the first time. This revolutionary publication and Martin Luther's protest unleashed the Protestant Reformation. Religious scholars are well aware that the New Testament was not written or recorded by Jesus' immediate disciples. But in all instances, they were transcribed some 50 to 75 years after the death of Jesus and many years after the death of his disciples. The stories of Jesus were considered passed down orally by his followers and memorized for fear that written mentions of Jesus and the original disciples, if found in the possession of early Christians, would be too dangerous, because the Romans and Jews still persecuted the early Christians for 3 centuries after the death of Christ. The greatest story ever told is without a doubt the story told by the conservative Christian right regarding the moral mandates they try to impose on the American people and the rest of the world, using the authority of the Judeo-Christian Bible. This is not to say that any or all of the Christian or Judaic Bibles are false or fabricated, but it does give a learned and open-minded individual pause to think for a moment about the many other authenticated texts of all the other world religions. The words of Abraham were not written by Abraham. The Quran was not written by Muhammad. The teachings of Christ were not written by Jesus, nor were the lessons of Socrates written by Socrates. All that is known of these men was described and transcribed by their followers, students, and disciples. If a disciple decides to deify his or her teacher, or wishes to create their own following or cult, they will create a godly connection to their master in glorious tales. The wisdom and truth bestowed on these inspired writings of parables or direct dialogue and teachings of the masters are considered the mark of authenticity bestowed on these words, or works rather. That authenticity of human and divine wisdom and prophecy are woven through all sacred texts. And they are honored and revered by each follower of that religion as the Word of God. A remarkable book entitled The Secret Scriptures, written by Dr. Qasim Khalil, published by Knowledge House Publishers, has brought to the public's attention the censored scriptures of one of Jesus' most devout disciples, Barnabas. The scriptures of Barnabas were hidden since the 5th century by the Catholic Church in the Pope's private library. Barnabas was the only disciple who was verified to have lived during the time of Jesus and was instructed by Jesus to be his scribe and record his teachings. It is well known amongst religious scholars that the Gospels of the Christian Bible were not written by those disciples who had been credited for them. It has been well documented by numerous biblical scholars that over 400 authors have contributed to the collection of works known as the Bible, which includes Old and New Testament. The scriptures of Barnabas describe a completely different Jesus than does the New Testament, which was revised and edited numerous times by the Catholic Church and many other Christian religions. Barnabas describes Jesus as a man, not a God, and states that Jesus often reprimanded all of his disciples for claiming him as divine. The teachings and life of Jesus, according to the scriptures of Barnabas, were extremely radical for their time. Nothing about Jesus describes him as a conservative or reactionary. Jesus was an extreme social and religious radical. His life and works created a 2,000-year worldwide revolution that caused the eventual destruction of the Roman Empire and spread the Christian revolution to every country and continent. Jesus was a liberal. Jesus was an extreme radical, as were all of his followers. Any past or present moral leader of historical significance has pronounced their devotion to the nonviolent teachings of Jesus and to the liberal ideology that mankind is inherently good and the virtues of peace, love, truth, freedom, and justice are the pillars of human existence. The spiritual and social ideals of conservative and reactionary ideologues are diametrically opposed to the two true teachings of Jesus. Jesus was a liberal. People gathered together as nations and religions do not have the right to inflict by violence and enslavement their religions on others. No one has the right given to them by any holy text unless their text has been mistranslated or is a text of an evil or satanic cult designed to harm an individual or degrade, rape, and murder an infidel or pagan or Gentile or Jew. If anything is true, peace and love for fellow men are the marks and characteristics of God. Any people who go to war, except in self-defense from attack or invasion, are morally wrong. War is a barbaric belief of uncivilized and ignorant human beings. The destruction and murder of another race, culture, or society to acquire by force their resources or wealth, or to annihilate a people for the face of the earth because of a violent racial hatred is morally wrong, when considered for use in any measure by enlightened human intelligence. All true men and women of God and conscience are radicals. Jesus was a radical. Moses was a radical. Buddha was a radical. Muhammad was a radical. Martin Luther was a radical. Martin Luther King Jr. was a radical. Mahatma Gandhi was a radical. Every progressive moral thinker has been and is a radical. Every fundamentalist of any religion is a reactionary. Anyone who believes that their sacred text is the absolute truth as it is written is a complete fool. Anyone who uses methods of violence, guilt, sanctions, ignorance, or malice, inflicts wounds, or oppresses another to accept their will or faith over their own is morally and reprehensibly wrong. If God created man, then he created all men. He created everyone. If God chose to speak with men, then he would communicate any way he wanted to. Why does an English-speaking person think God would only speak English? Why does a white man think God has to be white and force the world to think that way as well? Could it be for his own supremacy over others and have nothing to do with God? Why does a church or a mosque or synagogue have to be the absolute chosen sacred ground sanctioned by God? Didn't God and Jesus and Muhammad and every prophet roam the desert, or were expelled from somewhere and never allowed a real home to call their own? Christ supposedly said to Peter, "You are the rock I build my church upon." Isn't the basic teaching of all religions based upon the true believer living in their faith with little want for violence or material gain? Religious arrogance and intolerance is an evil greater than any other. It has caused more deaths, more separations, more conflict and division than any other cause of hatred known to mankind. The unholy throne of Satan is adorned with the many symbols of man's religions. One God, one good, one evil. There is nothing more simple to understand. Why the savage soul of man remains savage is because of its intolerance of others. One man accepts the reality, or whether once man accepts the reality, that God is all of his creation. War and conflict will end. Would Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or Socrates or Krishna argue over an individual having love, mercy, and compassion for another? I think not. That is God's message, and that concept is considered radical today. I make reference at the end of this chapter to refer to my essay, The Radical Soul, which is in the essay section of Metaphysics. And I'd like to read that with a few minutes I have remaining to the program. And I will do that. And it's called The Radical Soul. Again, I should mention that the good part of this book is actually 166 essays taken from my website over the last since November 04, when I first established that site. I should have marked it. This essay is called The Radical Soul. Now, I wrote this in December 4th, 2004. Something makes a radical radical. I haven't identified that certain attribute or detriment to the radical character yet. As I keep seeing more injustice and abuse of power and starving, crippled, homeless misery of millions or billions of people around the planet, I get angry and feel the need to do something about correcting the wrongs I see. I have discovered that it is a whisper from the soul that stirs me. A silent surge of emotion creates a tear, or makes me angry enough to swear at the television news commentator or videotaped sound bites by George W. Bush or Tom DeLay, Bill Frist, John Kerry, Joe Lieberman, and virtually every American politician. I think radicals are born, not made. I think a radical has always been a radical in his worldview. He or she cannot accept things that aren't just or are hurtful to humanity or other inhabitants on the planet. Some radicals are violent. The most famous and most effective radicals were nonviolent. I believe many people are born radicals. They are the men, women, and children who refuse to bend to the will of nature or suffer the indignity of physical or mental abuse and demand just retribution. A radical is anyone who will courageously fight back against anyone or anything they determine is a wrong against them or others. As a radical, I weigh my options and interests and willingness before I take action. Will I go to the courts? Will I write letters to a company's president or to government officials? Will I storm the Capitol building? Am I still trying to decide? I'm still trying to decide how radically radical I really am. I think I am like others who are waiting for their soul's whisper to turn into a shout or a scream, until we can no longer sit still or remain silent as the scale of justice is breaking under the weight of injustice. This last quote is from Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will be worse than the evil. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. Let your life be counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. And that was Henry David Thoreau, Civil Disobedience. I'm going to end tonight's show at that, and I want to thank everybody for joining me. And this is the name of the book. It's called Naked at the Mic, The Survival of a Liberal in a Time of Peril. It's available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and iUniverse.com, and is also, which is the publisher, which is also as a digital book, and that is available. Again, my new book. I hope you'll enjoy it. 364 pages of absolute me. So I hope you enjoy it. And also, we have of course, I have a radio show, which is on WQQQ 103.3 FM in Lakeville, Connecticut. And I also wanted to mention blogtalkradio.com/LASteelShow.org, which is the internet radio show on the Blog Talk network. We've been doing that for over 3 years now. We have over 500 archive programs on there. Also, I wanted to mention my website, which is lasteelshow.org. And I want to thank you very much for listening to me tonight. And that's my book. Good night.